Hello, everyone. We're going to wait about 30 seconds or so, let people continue to trickle in, and then we will start the webinar. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Just to be sensitive to time, we know some folks are still continuing to trickle in, but we want to welcome everyone to the Murdoch Trust General Grant Making Updates for Strategic Projects webinar. My name is Colby Reed. I'm the Vice President of External Affairs and Strategy here at the Trust, and I'll be facilitating today's session. I am joined today by Pauline Fong, Chief Program and Impact Officer. Before we get to the meat of today's conversation, I wanted to share just a few things to set the stage for our dialogue. First, the purpose of today's webinar is to share some context around recent grant demand and the Trust's response, share submission window dates, and communicate updates to the strategic project eligibility guidelines, as well as funding priorities that are applicable to all organizations. We also want to answer questions that you may have about these updates, as many as possible. Please note that webinars for each individual focus area will be taking place over the next 3 days. You can find which one you should attend and register on our website, murdochtrust.org. We highly encourage you to attend the session relevant to your organization if you have questions about specific eligibility for your focus area. Another important note is that this webinar series covers strategic project grants only. Strategic projects are capacity building grants that any eligible organization can apply for during our open submission windows. They come in 3 types: capital, equipment and technology, and program and staff. We will not be covering Murdoch Trust programs or initiatives in this series. Here's how the next 42-ish minutes or so are going to unfold. First, Pauline is going to walk through a presentation giving you some context and sharing specific updates in response. Then we will address some questions that came in during registration. After that, we're going to open things up for Q&A from all of you before we close. So as you're listening, if you have questions, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A box throughout the webinar. Also, please note that closed captions are available through the closed caption button. And with that, Pauline, I will turn things over to you.
Great. Thank you, Colby. And first of all, welcome, everyone. We're really glad that you're here. I know on this webinar are trustees, staff, leaders, volunteers, and I just want to first say thank you very much for being engaging with nonprofits, and thank you for all the nonprofits for all the ways that you make this world a better place. So thank you very much for all your passion and all your efforts and all your compassion. To begin with, I do want to briefly connect everything that we're about to cover here today back to the Trust mission, which is to build capacity in nonprofits driving innovative and sustainable outcomes across the Pacific Northwest. And that is towards the vision of human flourishing for the common good. So we're going to get into a lot of details in this webinar, and it's really important to ground all this discussion on details in this mission, more details to our mission and vision, as well as the Trust values and information about JAC can be found on the About Trust page on our website. So I do also want to share a few starter resources for anyone who is brand new to working with the Murdoch Trust. So we did see during the registration time that quite a few of you were joining us for the first time and learning about our processes and priorities as a first-time applicant. And we're so glad that you're here. What I'm about to share today will be some critical updates to our work. I'm not going to have time in this webinar to get into all of the details. So to get familiar with the overall process, I would want to encourage you to go to the strategic grant application page on the website. I would also just strongly encourage everyone, not just first time applicants, to please read our eligibility guidelines page on the website for more information about the different kinds of nonprofits that the trust partners with, the guidelines related to general project types. And these guidelines are being updated every 3 to 4 months as we seek to respond to the ever fast changing landscape. Next is I want to give some important context about the updates that will follow and the guidelines that will follow. As many of you watching this webinar know, the nonprofit sector is navigating an incredible amount of change, including major losses in resources, funding wise, economic uncertainty, increased service demand, and much, much more. And so this has led to a dramatic increase in grant applications as nonprofits seek to find funding through private philanthropy to replace the public funding. To put some numbers to it, in our last 3 month submission window, the trust received more than 670 LOIs, letters of inquiry, and that's about 3.5 times our historical average. As an illustration of what that means, it used to be a really busy day if we got 10 to 15 LOIs, but there were many days in December when we were getting close to 90 submissions each day. And so that tells us a few important things. First is that in the face of incredible challenges and changes, nonprofits are still doing amazing and deeply needed work. Again, thank you. Secondly, is that there's pressure and demand in the funding space that most of us, both nonprofits and philanthropy, have never felt before. And this requires a thoughtful response from us as a funder, because it's clear that we can't continue doing the exact same practices and eligibility that we had. So this moment requires something different from all of us. And I do believe that clear is kind and clarity is respect. So being clear about the trust funding priorities is one of the ways that we can respect you and your time and can help each of you assess alignments on potential proposals and make your own decisions about a possible LOI submission based on clear information. Before I go into the details, I do want to point you to a video that our CEO, Romanita Hairston, recorded with Colby recently about the state of the nonprofit sector and the trust's commitment to it. And in this video, Romanita shares that we remain committed to supporting as many nonprofits as possible through as many ways as we can, while balancing strategic priorities, capacity, resources, and a long-term outlook. So you can find this video on our website, and I do encourage you to watch it because it's an important conversation. In the short time that we have on this webinar, I will not be able to go through all of the guidelines that apply to general eligibility. Those are all clearly stated on the trust website. But I do want to walk through a few key changes in more detail in this webinar in the following categories. One is the new submission window. Second one is the focus eligibility guidelines and funding priorities. The third one is new support for shared services and collaborative projects. And the last category that we will address is distributing key resources that can benefit the entire nonprofit sector. All right, so let's go to the first one. The first one is the submission windows. So clear submission windows for both LOIs and applications will provide clear timelines and expectations for nonprofits inquiring about potential funding. Again, clear is kind and clarity is respect. So given the increased demand, we saw the need to give more time to thoughtfully review the LOIs because we're getting such a large volume. And submission windows were updated on the website about a month ago in early February. But I do want to specifically highlight that 1 month in this period to submit LOIs in this coming up period, March 9th through April 9th. And you could review the page for more details about dates, decisions, and if your LOI is approved to submit a full application, the date to fill out applications and all that. So I won't walk through the details here because you can review the page yourself on the website. I do, though, want to take a few moments to walk through this coming LOI submission period that has some unusual parameters. And Colby, can you go on to the next slide? So first thing is to talk about why we're making a change. So we saw, as I noted, a record volume at the end of 2025 that required us to decline hundreds of projects that we would have wanted to support in any other time. And we owe applicants a process that respects your time. So for this new cycle, this upcoming submission period, for what's new is that we're going to cap the intake of LOIs at 300 eligible submissions. And that submission window will close as soon as that cap is reached, even if it's before April 9th. So a couple more things. One is March 9th is going to be when the window opens for returning grantees, those who have received a trust grant within the last 4 years. And then the following week, on March 16th, the window will open for all eligible applicants, including first-time or returning applicants. So I do want to specifically note what makes a strong LOI. A well-planned project, clearly defined, not a rushed submission. Um, Clearly articulating what is the work that you're proposing, what is the scope of the impact, and what are you expecting in terms of outcomes, what's the estimated budget. An early submission does not necessarily equal a competitive submission. And so I do want to encourage a thoughtful, well-planned LOI for it to be competitive. Our commitment to you. So this change to this upcoming submission period is a pilot. We are taking this as a pilot, and then we will adapt based on the feedback and outcomes from this pilot. We're doing the best we can to really balance two things. One is long-term grantee relationships for long-term capacity building, with the need to make sure that there's access for new applicants. And so we know that this moment is very challenging, and we don't take these decisions lightly, but we're really trying to seek to balance those two things: long-term grantee relationships for long-term capacity building and access for new applicants. All right, so let's get into some of the details on some of the updated general eligibility guidelines and priorities. Okay, so the first thing is some recent updates I want to point out that I'm seeing in a lot of LOIs that maybe it's a change from historical practice, so some clarification is needed. So the first thing is submission frequency. So if you receive a grant award, then 3 years after that date of that grant that is awarded, you can submit a new LOI. Or if your grant request was declined, then a year after that decline date is when you can submit a new LOI submission. And so to talk about why that is, we're really trying to balance access to people who have already gotten a grant, who have already submitted a grant, with the hundreds who are trying to make sure that they have an opportunity to submit a request. So that's the reason for that submission frequency guideline. And again, you can see that on the website. Second one that I want to get into is a recent update, specifically related to development and fundraising related positions. So the current guideline is that the trust will only consider requests related to the first development position, the first fundraising related position. And so the reason for that is we believe that if you have a good fundraising position, or if the first one is funded, then really that will generate the revenues needed to fund the second or the third or the fourth needed development related position. So we do see a lot of requests for development positions these days, especially, and we want to make sure that we can specifically support those who are in that inflection period of trying to hire that first development and fundraising related staff. Okay, and then the last, most recent update I want to highlight is that we are updating the project request thresholds. So the 100,000 minimum project size and 50,000 minimum request to the trust has been the historical practice for over 20 years. And as we looked at the changing landscape, it's necessary to update that number. So the current new minimum project size is what you see on the screen, which is the minimum project that is being proposed needs to be about $200,000 minimum in scope. And the request to the trust needs to be 100,000 minimum in the request itself. So those are some of the highlights I wanted to specifically point out. And as I noted before, there are many other guidelines related to the type of nonprofits, the type of projects that are in even more detail on the website. I would want to encourage you to take a look at that. I'm not going to have time to highlight here. All right, and then the next section is we do want to talk about some collaboration support. The trust will also now receive inquiries about strategic collaborative efforts and shared services. Now, this came about because of what we heard in the listening sessions that we hosted last year throughout the 5 states. And we heard many nonprofits tell us that funders often encourage collaborations but don't fund them. And so we heard you, and we also recognize that in a funding landscape where we can't fund every individual proposal that we receive, supporting collaboratives and shared services would be an important way that we can maximize resources to multiple organizations. So in considering LOIs for these type of collaborative efforts, we will prioritize submissions that demonstrate a scope of impact. So please do consider the true full scope of impact from the project that you're proposing and be sure to communicate that clearly in your LOI. As you consider these projects, please know that we see you as the experts on the needs of your organization, and you really are the experts on who you should be collaborating with. And so conversations with the trust are not going to be focusing on recommendations for how the project should be done, but really on helping determine whether or not your project is a good fit for trust priorities. So how do you do this? So this is a slightly different process than all the other strategic projects proposals. So I do want to go over that for a little bit. So the first thing is when you approach the trust with a request for a pre-LOI increase. So please approach the trust and have a conversation with us before you submit an LOI about collaborations. In your request for that pre-LOI conversation, please include the following information. First thing, most important is who are you collaborating with? What kind of collaboration is being proposed? Who are the entities? What's the project being proposed? And then the what, like what kind of outcomes and what kind of impact will come because of this collaboration. And then lastly, do include a little bit of information about what's the potential cost or budget for this collaboration. So I want to show you the language that is on the trust website about these collaborations because we are getting quite a few requests about these. And so we've attempted to provide some language to help inform on what kind of collaborations are we talking about. And I would say there are really kind of a couple of categories. One is really around addressing a shared challenge, a collective impact model, or some sort of strategic partnership. And then the other bucket really are organizations trying to come together to share services that then serve multiple organizations. And so both of those are different types of collaborations, but are totally valid in this request. Okay, I think that's that for collaborations. And lastly, I do want to talk about just some resources for all nonprofits that the trust has identified and help to distribute that can benefit all nonprofits, those that we're able to fund and those that we are not able to fund at this point. So a few things. One is there's an excellent webinar series from the Nonprofit Association of Oregon on strategic restructuring and consolidation efforts. And so I did want to just highlight that. That's an excellent series that really gives information on how do you think through strategic restructuring in today's landscape with the lack of funding and yet the increased mission needs. And so that I just want to really point you to that excellent resource. Another resource that's on the page is the Nonprofits Get It Done campaign that the National Council of Nonprofits has been doing all over the nation. And as you know, there's a lot of false narratives going on about nonprofits, and this campaign really shows the crucial and the essential work that nonprofits do. And I know many of you you would want to have like resources to be able to show that to your constituents and to those in the community around you, but you may not have the media team to be able to do that. So please do take a look at that because I think it has some really great materials that can help you get the word out there about the crucial work that nonprofits do and try to engage with that, addressing that false narrative. And then the last resource that I want to highlight in this webinar is that there are nonprofit meeting spaces here at the Trust, including a new space that's opening up at the Trust in April that we are going to make available to nonprofits to use. And so again, the information is both on the website and also after this webinar, we'll send links to these resources in the follow-up email that you can get into. So before we go into questions from registration, I just want to note that while there are some immediate steps that the trust has taken in response to the grant demand, we are continuing to evaluate our processes alongside the shifting landscape, and that's ever changing. And so we truly do take a posture of continuous improvement with these updates, and we will continue to evaluate and update you as we go. So deeply appreciate your patience and understanding as we navigate this challenging time together. All right, Colby, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you, Pauline. Wonderful rundown of kind of the top line of our updates. And so now we want to turn things over to questions from the audience. First, if you were listening to Pauline's presentation, if you had a question, please feel free to put those in the Q&A box now. Before we get to those questions, we did receive some in advance to your registration that we wanted to go ahead and address right off the bat. So first question is, can you clarify the rules around submitting new applications after being awarded? Is that 3-year timeline based on the award date or the funding distribution date?
Yeah, great question. So definitely it's on the awarded date, because depending on the project, sometimes the grant is awarded and it takes a while to find the staff. And so every project has its own nuances around when the funding is actually distributed. So really we're going with the date that the grant was awarded.
Excellent. Second question we received, are organizations that work primarily in international contexts but are based in or have offices in the Pacific Northwest eligible? Does the organization need to be headquartered in the Pacific Northwest to be eligible?
Again, a great question. So the easiest way I think to understand this is that the trust really is a regional funder focused on the Pacific Northwest. And so while the trust does have a small set of organizations that are national that the trust supports, that's really by invite only. So for strategic projects, what we're looking for is, regardless of where your office is, does the proposed project have at least 50% Northwest impact? So whether or not your office is overseas or here, does the project that you're asking the trust to support, does it have at least 50% Northwest impact in the trust five-state region? So that's the best way. That I found that's the simplest way to think about that. Otherwise, I think there's lots of different ways you could name that question, and I've seen that question probably in 5 or 6 different forms. So go with does the project have 50% Northwest impact? I find the easiest way to go about answering that.
Excellent. And then you talked about the new collaborative project grants. Are funding ranges higher for those collaborative projects?
Yeah, I actually scratched my head a little bit when I was trying to figure out how to answer that question, because we're really new to this. And so I would say we're not sure, not necessarily. It really depends on what collaboration you're proposing, and is really focused on the impact of the scope of impact. The other reason why it's a little bit difficult to answer that is we see projects that range a whole spectrum, from the very small to very, very like giant projects. And so I'm not sure how to answer that question in terms of typical range, because we don't actually have a typical range. Like I can average out the grants from the year, but we don't really have a typical range as far as that's concerned, since our focus really is on what project does your organization need to do and what's that cost. And so for every nonprofit and every project is totally different. So a little bit difficult to answer that question because I can't establish what a typical range is. And then also, to be honest, we're just new at trying to consider these. And so again, I would just encourage really less thinking about what's the request funding range that's possible, but more focus on what's the scope of impact that your project is trying to propose. What are the outcomes? And then you do provide like an overall estimated project. And then when staff are in those pre-LOI conversations with you about the request, then that would be a better time to talk through the nuances of the project and size, and then figure out what might be the range of the request. So that's the way I would suggest going about that.
Excellent, thank you. So now we're going to go to audience Q&A. Again, please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A box. We'll get through a few of these. If we don't have time to answer your question, or later today something comes to you, please feel free to email us at grants@murdochtrust.org, and the grants team member will get back to you. Our first question comes from Lisa, and I think this is a great question for folks that want to be ready to submit their LOI the day that the LOI window opens. Is it possible to see recommendations for letter of inquiry content and format before the application portal opens?
Yeah, unfortunately, we can't do that. However, I can just tell you what we're looking for in an LOI in general, that it would be really, really help. You need to make sure you have that information. So generally speaking, for an LOI, what we're looking for is what's your organization. So there's some basic information that I think will be fairly simple to just all input. Then really what we're asking for is what is your proposed project? You are going to feel like I'm a broken record because really it's the same thing that we're seeking to understand is what is the proposed project? Who does it involve? What is it about? And then what is the impact that you're anticipating from if you were to do the project? And what are some measurable outcomes that you think might be coming from the project? And then what's the budget that that this project is going to require? So it's actually not different than the collaborations ones that I just talked about. It's actually the same categories of what we're looking for in order to figure out if it's a good fit for trust priorities. I would encourage whatever project you're proposing to both check it against the general eligibility guidelines and also your project lands in one of our areas of focus, and webinars will be forthcoming in these next few days on specific areas of focus. So that would be the other thing you can do is to prepare yourself by finding out what area of focus, what sector does your work, your proposed project actually land in, and then being really clear on does it align with the priorities in that area. That would be the best way to prepare for that LOI request. Then, because then you'll be really clear before the LOI request. Oh, is the request that I'm putting forward, does that align with the priorities of that area? And those would be the one that would be most competitive, I would say. So that is what I would suggest in terms of preparing for the LOI submission. Um, if you know your project and you know what you're going to request, we're not asking for some of the detailed financials at this point at the LOI stage. So that would be the best way to prepare for it.
Great. And I want to circle back on, you were talking in that response about the who and who's involved. Rachel has a great follow-up question. For collaborative projects with other nonprofits, do all of the nonprofits that are in the collaborative need to meet trust qualification guidelines for eligible organizations?
That is a very interesting question. And so, again, we're trying to figure that out. So, from what I've seen, I've actually heard about a couple of projects that are an interesting collaboration between a nonprofit and a government entity, for example, and the request then would come from the nonprofit. So, the way I would answer that is definitely at least the entity requesting the collaboration needs to be an eligible nonprofit. And you can see all the eligible entities on our trust website. So at least the one bringing forth the collaboration requests. So generally speaking, there are many or a few or a couple who are bringing forth this request together. And typically what I've seen so far in the increase is one nonprofit is serving as the point lead. And so that would be that nonprofit would need to be an eligible entity.
Great. Terry has a great clarifying question around submission frequency. Regarding submission frequency, can an organization submit a new proposal 3 years after the gift was awarded? Or if it's a multi-year request, say, for example, one of our 3-year staff grants, is it 3 years after the last distribution of the gift?
Great question, great clarification. Again, is the date that the grant was awarded. So for example, if you got a grant in February 2023, then then it would be March, 3 years after that, 2026, that you could submit the LOI or whatever is closest to that submission window, right? Because March, it just so happens March does land on a submission window open date. But let's say you were awarded on a date and then 12 months after that, it doesn't land in a submission window, then whatever is closest to that. And we do have several submission windows each year. So whatever is closest to that submission window. But to highlight, it's the grant awarded date.
Allie has a great question, and it's one I know that we've wrestled with, Pauline, in terms of communication and that issue of clarity that you were talking about. She asks, how will the trust communicate when the LOI cap has been reached? Orgs have understood the end of the window to be the hard deadline. Now it seems like we should be thinking of the first day of the window as our deadline. So how do we make sure that folks aren't putting work into an LOI, but then coming to realize that the cap was already reached?
Yeah, great question. And that's why we're only doing this for one period as a pilot, as a way to figure out how do we work with those if we were to do this again. The way I would answer that is, let's say, for example, you are in the process of filling out an LOI and you get on the website, and this is how we will communicate it, is on the website, it'll say LOI window is closed if it closes before April 9th. And so if that's the case, if let's say you're still working on it, your LOI, so for example, let's say on March 30th, we reach the 300 LOI cap and we close the submission window. Your draft is still in the LOI in our grants management system. And so you can wait till the next time the LOI period opens back up. So in the next period, which is July, and I can't remember off the top of my head what date it is on July, but it is July, I do know that. So let's say you are not able to get into this March one because the 300 cap has been reached. Then you would just hold your LOI and you'll be able to go back and work on it again when July opens back up. And so you're not going to lose the work that you've already done, but you won't be able to submit it either because we'll have closed the cap. But you can then submit it in the next LOI submission period. So again, this is our way of trying to figure out different ways to manage the volume. And with 670 LOIs, we had to say no to basically 82% of the applicants, LOI applicants. And that's not what we want to do. We want to respect your time. And so you can hold the LOI and then come back when the next LOI period opens.
Beth has a great clarifying question as well. Are there limitations when it comes to submitting a new LOI after the LOI has been declined, or is it only if your grant application has been declined that there's the 1 year waiting period?
So it is both. And again, because we're dealing with volume, if we went back and reviewed every single decline LOI one more time, then it prevents other new LOIs from being able to be reviewed. And so if your LOI has already been declined, please do not resubmit that again. But you can consider a different project. So this is what I'll say. I saw quite a few LOIs that did not understand the priorities in the areas of focus. And so some did meet all the general eligibility, but in a particular area or a particular sector, the proposed project really did not meet our priorities at this moment. And so I would encourage you to look at that, because it could be that your organization is completely eligible, but the project that you were proposing was not our priorities at the moment. But if you actually looked at the area of focus or the sector, you realize, oh, that's the priority. Oh yeah, I have a project that would totally fit with that. So, but then again, that's a new LOI because it really is around a different project. And so I would just suggest doing that to really figure out, is there a different project that really fits with the strategic priorities of that sector or that area that I can submit?
Nina would like to touch on the decision to open the LOI window first for returning grantees and then for new grantees. And her ask is, can you expand on the decision to separate the application opening date for returning and new applicants? Is the expectation that we're going to increase the funding rate for returning applicants?
I think really the value behind that is the trust really values relationships with our grantees. And what I've seen over the years is some of the grantees who have had multiple projects is a building capacity over the long haul. And that's pretty exciting to see. So we're trying to balance that value with continuing to make sure that there is access for new applicants. And so that's a way to make sure that the returning grantees have a chance to submit LOIs. So in our last submission period, we actually saw 80% brand new applicants. And so that was kind of, it has shifted that way. And so this is a way to try to balance that. Having said that, because it is it's a short restricted window in terms of who the returning grantees are that can have that 1 week start early start, early action date, it is a limited pool of returning grantees that would fit in that category. And so and again, we're trying this one time to learn from it and to see if there's anything that doesn't work. And we'll take the learnings and then figure out how to apply that to the next submission period.
Jacqueline has a great question for first-time submitters regarding the LOI. If we are a first-time submitter, is the LOI portal open to start filling out the form but not actually hitting submit until March 16th, or do we only have access to that form starting on March 16th?
The LOI portal will be open for everyone. And then basically, if you're a new applicant, then hit that submit button on March 16th. Yes, great.
Excellent. I'm excited to answer Valerie's question because it's a question I can answer, and that is, will a replay of the webinar be available? Yes, we will have recordings of all of our webinars available on our website. We'll also be sending those out via email within 48 hours of the webinar being completed. So thank you for that, Valerie. This is a question from Lily. If an organization already has a development position filled, are they able to ask for a fundraising position if they've identified that as the greatest need in their organization?
Unfortunately, not under current guidelines. So that is an eligibility guideline that I highlighted earlier in the webinar. And the reason for that is we really believe if you have your first fundraising position, development position filled, and that position is effective, it should be able to generate revenues for the other subsequent fundraising positions that you are trying to hire. And again, this is in the context of overwhelming need. We are seeing so many LOIs for development positions. So many, way more than I have ever seen before. And again, we know it's because of the funding landscape change and the need to really look at a different funding resources than there was before. But because of the sheer number of need, strategic choice is that we want to fund that first position that is typically the most difficult. And as you get that, then that should generate revenues then to fill subsequent fundraising positions.
Ricardo has a great question about timing. He's wondering, can you share a rough estimate on the timeline for the review process between an LOI submission and an estimated date of notification of decision?
Okay, great question, Ricardo. That is all on the website. And actually, I would have to pull up the website because I don't have the dates in my head. So, and maybe the team could help me pull that submission window slide back up. It was earlier in our slide deck. That would be helpful because I don't have all of it in my head right now. All that I have is that first submission period, March 9th through April 9th. So it is on the Trust website. Thank you, team. So there it is. And what we're trying to be clear here is when can you submit the LOI? When will you get a decision on the LOI? And then if you have been approved, your LOI was approved to submit a full application, when would you be able to fill out that application? And then when would you receive a grant decision? So it's all there on the website and here also on that slide.
Great. We've got time for just probably 2 or 3 more questions before we wrap up. Erica has a great question. You mentioned contacting the trust prior to an LOI about for a project that has a collaborative component. Do you also want this for other projects, or if it's just for that collaborative initiative?
It is for that collaborative initiative for sure. And I would say there, and if you are part of the artistic and cultural expressions area of focus, there is a pre-LOI conversation required for organization, and this is coming in that webinar. So I would, if you are an artistic and cultural expressions nonprofit, please do attend that webinar so that you could get the fuller context. But there is a pre-LOI required for some artistic and cultural expressions nonprofits with a operating budget threshold of less than 200,000. So that's only specific to that area of focus and for these collaborative projects. Other than that, no specific pre-LOI conversations are required. And I would actually suggest not doing those unless you have a very, very specific question. This is why we try to make sure everything is clear and as much details as possible is on the Trust website, because we really do want you to be able to sort through those yourself and self-assess on whether or not you want to submit an LOI, and that information is accessible to you at all times. However, if you do have a question after reviewing all these guidelines, you're like, yeah, but I have a very unique situation, or I read it, but I really didn't understand that. The best way to get support for your question is to be sure to email grants@murdochtrust.org, and a grants team member will get back to you. Those are triaged every day, every business day, and those are responded to. So that's the quickest way and the fastest way, most efficient way you can get a response on your question, rather than trying to wait to schedule a pre-LOI conversation due to capacity limits. And again, because we got hundreds and hundreds of LOI requests, to support these pre-LOI calls is just not possible due to staff capacity constraints. So the best and easiest way is to email grants@murdochtrust.org, and then you can get your question answered that way. If there's a question that's beyond kind of the basics and you email that, then it'll get escalated to the right person to answer that, if the person who's manning that inbox can't answer it in the moment. So again, this is kind of our scaled pathway for the easiest and the quickest response to the support that you need.
Right. We're coming up on time, so I think we're going to get to 2 more questions and then we're going to wrap up. There's far more than that in the queue. So if your question does not get answered, please feel free to email us grants@murdochtrust.org and we would be happy to follow up with you. Carol asks, talking about the cap on LOIs, the 300 LOIs per submission window, is that just for strategic projects, or is it 300 for all types of submissions? So strategic projects, programs, and initiatives?
No, everything we talked about today in this webinar is specific only to strategic projects. So please be clear about that. The 300 is only related to strategic projects. That's where we saw the volume increase. Our initiatives, programs, everything else, those are through different pathways and have different parameters and different guidelines that are specific to that initiative or specific to that program. So those are not being considered here. This webinar and all the information that you have heard or will hear when you replay the webinar is really specific to strategic projects, which are open access. Any eligible nonprofit can come to us with a project that fits the strategic priorities.
Great. And we're going to close on this question. I think it's a great question from Adam, and then we're going to wrap up. Is there a time during a capital project that the Murdoch Trust likes to award a grant? So do we prefer to award our grants for capital projects more at the beginning of fundraising, more towards the end of fundraising, more in the middle? What's our sweet spot?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a little bit difficult to answer that question, I'll just say. So let me name a few things that I think are principles to inform the answer to that question. One is, it's really, really important to seek a demonstration of community support for a project. And so if you come in too early and there is no demonstration of community support, then that would be too early. If you come in after the project is already finished, then that timeline is too late. And so the preferred timing is somewhere in the middle. And so this is where submitting the LOI, having the plan in place. So I do want to just emphasize the project needs to be well planned. And so if the planning isn't in place, then that's not the right time to submit the project. That's actually too early. And I've actually seen a couple of those in this most recent batch where people are like, the actual property has not been identified for buying. The intent to buy is there, but the project itself, in terms of the property has not been identified, the renovation plans are not in place, then that's actually too early to come in. And sometimes it takes some time to figure out where the community support will come from, what your funding plan is. So again, that's part of the planning of the project that needs to be in place. But don't wait so late that, and as you know, as you look at the submission windows, you can clearly see what the timeline of the decisions are. And so you do want to submit then your LOI and your application in time so that your project is not completed before a grant decision. So that's the way I would look at it, is look at the submission window graph or diagram. Think about when is the end date, like when are you expecting your capital project to be completed, and you want that date to be after a grant decision date. So that's the way to think about it. Look at the chart and then think about your project completion date, and you want to make sure that you're in a timeline that makes sure that your project is considered by trustees for a grant decision before your project is complete. So I hope that's clear. Colby, you can help me if there's a different way that
No,
I need to restate that, but that's the best way to
I
think
thought
about it.
I
So
thought
there
it was
is no
very.
clear, we want you to come in the beginning or in the back end, but to make sure that those principal information or points of evaluation are actually considered in your timing.
What I heard was once the project is planned, but before it's completed, then somewhere in there is where we're looking for, right, Pauline?
Yes, thank you. Great summary. Thanks, Colby.
No, thank you, Pauline. This has been incredibly informative and action-packed. Thank you so much for that. A few important reminders as we wrap up this session. First, within a few days, you'll receive a follow-up email from us that will include the recording of today's session, links to the resources we discussed, and a link to a brief post-webinar survey. Really encourage you to complete that survey. Your feedback helps us improve these sessions and our work and make sure that we're providing the information you need in the most helpful way possible. We also want to encourage you to attend the focus area session later this week that is relevant to your organization, which you can find and register for on our website. I would also like to personally thank Jenna Watson and Mayla Flom for all of their help on the back end, putting today's webinar on and handling our tech support. And we also want to thank you all for joining us. And most of all, thank you for the ways that you support our Pacific Northwest communities through your critical work every day. Have a great day, everyone.